Hello, this is Melissa, and it's the second day of February 2023, and this is Real History. And thank you for tuning in. Today, I'm going to be joined by Jim in Indiana. Are you there, Jim?
I sure am. Glad to be here.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time to join me, and I'm really looking forward to this. We've had an opportunity to talk a few times over the last few months, and I've enjoyed talking with you. And we had a good conversation yesterday, and one of the things that we talked about, I asked you a few questions about when you began and how you began to question reality as it was presented to you. And you shared a little bit of that with me. I think that it was interesting, and I thought maybe you'd want to launch into like Vietnam and CBS News and all of that.
Yes. While I was growing up, I was born in 1961, by the way.
Okay.
And as far back as I can remember there being a TV, there was a broadcast news event that happened every afternoon by Walter Cronkite, and it had to do with the Vietnam War. So I might be 5 years old at the time when I'm really hearing all this talk about what's going on over in Southeast Asia and really not knowing anything about it except that it is on the news every night with Walter Cronkite telling us, and that's the way it is, and then giving the date.
Mm-hmm.
So, it had me questioning, from a real young age, what are we doing there? I was really confused about why this was happening. Why are people traveling so far to be in conflict? And it remained a question.
You told me yesterday that your parents, maybe they were like independent in their politics, but it wasn't a really political household where there was a lot of arguing or talking about politics. Do you recall if they were vocal in what they thought was going on in Vietnam?
There wasn't anything really voiced or vocalized concerning that. I seem to remember a lot of worry going on, but I might interject that my dad was in the Korean War, and he was there when he was a young man, and I don't think his experience there was very good. He didn't ever talk about it. He seemed to be set apart from anything that had to do with war and killing and that sort of thing. And my uncle, on the other hand, was in the Korean War, but he was in a bomber. He was one of them guys that sat in the bubble on a bomber. I think it was a B-17, and ran missions over Korea, North Korea.
Mm-hmm.
And my dad just did not take up any speech about it, and it seemed to be kind of a hush matter as I was growing up.
And your uncle coming back from that, was he vocal about his experiences or his thoughts?
He didn't really relay too many thoughts. He talked about his missions and being shot at and plane being hit and so forth, but he really didn't get into any kind of opinion about right or wrong, whether we should be there or not.
One of the next events or periods in your life that you talked about that you said had a very big impact on you was what happened to your father and your father's business in the 1970s. He was an independent trucker, and he unfortunately suffered from what was going on with the Teamsters organizing independent truckers. And if you could talk a little bit about that, that would be interesting.
Yes, So I may have been 13, maybe 14 when that took place. It was in the middle 70s. And one day everything was fine with his business. He contracted to deliver concrete products with trucks owned by my uncle and my dad, and that was their business. And they did that for years before, I was even born. They were already doing that before I was born. And so, I'm 13 or 14 years old, and the next thing I know, Teamsters Union had signed up my dad's drivers in a private meeting and sent them out on strike, causing my father to default on his contract carrying for the concrete products, and therefore he ended up losing his business through some contract. I guess it was just the legality part of the contract that if he couldn't fulfill his end of the contract, that he would have to depart with his equipment and trucks. And that kind of happened overnight, really.
So what you were explaining to me is that they didn't, steal his trucks and his equipment, but he was forced to sell everything that he had, all of his trucks, all of his equipment, was it the concrete company that was now basically owned by the Teamsters? Is that how it worked? Or?
The company remained with its own name, but the Teamsters had got the company to sign up as a Teamsters Union shop.
Mm-hmm.
And so not only did he lose his trucks at that point, he still needed to make money, a weekly check, to bring home, and therefore he had to go back to work for the same company that was now a Teamster shop and basically start working within the Teamster Union.
Okay.
And that was, that was kind of a blow to him. I mean, I could physically see it in his face. He was not happy about anything after that as far as work.
Right. I didn't know much about that era or Teamsters, and I did a little bit of looking into some things yesterday after we spoke, and you probably have already done a lot of this homework, but Jimmy Hoffa was a name that I'd heard my whole life, and nobody in my family was a member of a union of any kind, but it was just one of those names that you couldn't avoid hearing. And he had, it was rumored that he was involved with the mob, and that may actually be confirmed. I don't know. But it was said that supposedly this Teamster leader, who had been a Teamster boss for a couple of decades, I think, just disappeared, and it was assumed to be a mob hit. But one of the things that I learned when researching this was that, because I kept scratching my head about what you were telling me yesterday, that I just thought truck drivers went to a place and picked up their load and then took it someplace else and dropped off the load. That has always been my understanding of the trucking business. But after we spoke and I did a little bit of research into it, what I realized is the Teamsters seem to have created an environment where they more or less de facto are running a lot of different kinds of construction businesses. And one of the things I stumbled onto yesterday was a movie that was made called Donnie Brasco. I think that might have been a Martin Scorsese film, but I was basically explaining to the viewer how the big construction, the world of big business construction is really totally run by the Teamsters, and concrete would be a really big part of that construction business.
Yes, I imagine it would have been considered that. I didn't do a lot of research into the background of the Teamsters. My mind, my mind became pretty made up that they were not a good element. And later, when my dad passed away, they didn't pay off his pension in full. And so I just didn't have.
Talk about that, because it's a pretty brutal little story about what happened to your mother. You said that your father passed away at a very young age. He was 54. He had some lung problems. This would have been most likely because of the fact that he was around concrete dust for 25 years.
Yes, he was confined into small quarters, beating concrete loose from the inside of mixers, and no protection as far as anything covering his face, any kind of mask or anything. No respirator. Things that you would not be allowed to do under OSHA requirements. And he ended up with lung cancer and passed away 2 weeks after diagnosis. And at that time, that was a pretty quick row in our lives. And, suddenly the family was without income. He passed away in September of 1982. And we were getting ready to face wintertime here in Indiana, and really didn't have the means to pay our liquid propane bill. And I resorted to going out and cutting wood, and we did have a wood stove and a couple fireplaces, so we were able to get heat that way. But it pretty much sent the family into chaos.
And you had said that your father's pension at that time, that the amount of money that should have been delivered to your mother upon his death was around $17,000?
Yes, that's correct. And they issued a check to my mother, who was really, really past needing money, for a couple thousand and some change. And she really never had any choice. She went ahead and cashed the check, and that was basically saying, okay, the deal's been satisfied, and that's what you get. So she would have needed to, know the ropes and figure out how to fight this. She's in grief. She had 5 children at that point. That's right? Yes, that's correct. My older brothers and my older sister had their own families started. And one of my older brothers actually lived there with us, with his children, with his family, because it was a pretty hard time back in those days. Right on up to, maybe 1982, 83, it was a really hard life in the area. Shortage of jobs, high gas prices, you name it. Right. It was just hard to overcome. So that was a very defining time for you, just personally, in terms of the system itself. Maybe not government, but just the system had a brutality to it. Right. Yeah. I kind of liken the government to organized crime anyway, and I felt like the Teamsters were part of organized crime, maybe not the same branch, but yeah, it caused me to take on a completely different role in my life. In fact, when my dad passed away, I was 21 years old, and getting ready to make way for myself, and then all of a sudden, well, you're going to have to hang out and make sure Mom's got heat and whatever you can do to help bring in groceries, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. The house was paid off, thankfully, but right. That doesn't really do a lot of good when there's not any income.
Right.
I think I was making $4.25 an hour at the time in the construction industry.
What were you doing at that time?
Well, we did a lot of remodeling, replacing trim, painting, drywall work, pouring concrete for sidewalks and patios. And we just got started on what would have been my friend Tom's first house as a general contractor.
So now, all of these years later, now you are a master carpenter, very good at your work. But when you were starting out, were you just getting a feel for all the different aspects of construction? Had you already studied a bit of carpentry? What was the...
Actually, I began in a lumber supply house as a co-op student in high school. In other words, I would leave high school at noon and go to work for the lumber supply house, and on weekends, on Saturdays, and kind of learned about every product that there is for building, from the nails right on up to the toilet paper holders and stuff that go in to finish a job. And at the time that I left there, I got started in a framing contractor's position. Unfortunately, the job was all the way up in Indianapolis, which is 35 miles away. So I would drive on Monday morning to Indianapolis and actually sleep in my car during the nights, summer and winter both, and conduct framing tasks for them during the day, and then come back home on Friday evenings. Mm. So it was what I did to have a job at that time, yes. Shortly after that, I started working with my buddy who became a general contractor that I grew up with. And that's when my father passed away.
Okay. So you described to me that you felt that your family was close. They weren't particularly political, and they weren't religious. You said that your mother had a few outings with Jehovah's Witness was one, and there was another time where she went through a period of a little bit of church going and maybe bringing that to the family. But you weren't political, you weren't religious, but you described yourself as definitely a close all-American family.
Oh yeah, definitely. There was maybe 13 families in the subdivision that I lived in, and none of the families within that subdivision were particularly religious, nor did I hear any political speak from them, mm-hmm. bad or good.
So they were more interested. I mean, the conversation was more about maybe basic survival, the jobs, the economy, the ball games.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. What hunting season it was.
Now, that's another thing that you told me yesterday that I liked. You said that your father was always so busy working and running his trucking company, and you were very close to him. You said that he was your best friend, but you said he never had time for some of those things that, maybe a son wants to learn from the father, but that your oldest brother had picked up the slack there, and he's the one that taught you hunting and, basic firearm safety and skills.
And fishing.
Fishing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. he had a hard time teaching me with the hunting as far as finding the easy way through brush. I would be in the thick of briars and then saying, how do I get out of here? You know? And that's a time period when, you know, we lived along a highway, and when, you know, it was hunting season for squirrels, deer, rabbit, so forth. We walked right along the side of the road, our shotgun over our shoulder, and it was nothing new. I mean, that's just the way it was. Their shotguns were in the back windows of pickup trucks, you know.
Right.
It was a rural farming community. We didn't have a farm, but that's what we were surrounded by. And, you know, we went to all the different places that we could walk and go fishing or go hunting, and then sometimes talk mom or dad into taking us over here into the next county to go fish from this lake or that lake. So, yeah, we had a really good childhood.
Well, that's nice.
In that respect.
Yeah. You carried on talking about various events that had helped you along. I don't know if help is the right word, but they had definitely changed the way you saw reality as it was presented and the way that you saw the government. And after we talked, I thought, wow, you know, that's really interesting, because these events that you mentioned, Ruby Ridge in 1991, was that the year?
91 and 92.
91, yep. Okay. And then came Waco. And
in 93.
And then the wasn't the first World Trade Center bombing also in 93? Or I can't recall that now.
I think that didn't have as big an impact on me. I seen that as, you know, there's some evil character that wanted to cause death on people, and he was a terrorist type of situation.
Well, I can see that perception too, because it wasn't until years later that some of the, you know, the FBI infiltration, the radicalization even by our own government agencies didn't come out until much later.
Yes. Yeah, I learned differently about the first World Trade bombing than, you know, from what you've seen on the surface and what the news reports were. You know, that digging I did quite a few years later. But as far as Ruby Ridge, you know, that was kind of like a wake-up call, you know, like, hey, wait a minute here.
You know,
this guy.
It's interesting because obviously I've listened to Alan, I've listened to other people talk about Ruby Ridge, but that event and Waco happened before I was questioning anything much about anything. And I did not follow those events. I did follow Waco a little bit because it happened in Texas and it felt closer to home. But I did not follow Ruby Ridge. And this morning I took a little bit of time and I watched a PBS, that's Public Broadcasting Service here in the States, documentary that was put out about it. And I have to say that considering the source, it felt fairly even-handed. And I did not know much about the event except that there was a man named Randy Weaver who lived in Idaho on a mountain with his family, and that he had been under some kind of a siege by the FBI, and his wife and his son were killed. And that really was the limit of what I understood. And listening to his daughter Sarah Weaver spoke throughout this documentary, and I have to say that she was one of the most well-spoken women, very even, really put across what happened and what her memories were of that time. And I was brought to tears several times watching this. It was such a terrible tragedy. And of course, even though the FBI came out afterwards and said what happened was wrong, even though the family was awarded a substantial settlement, and even though, as Sarah Weaver said, the FBI now uses the Ruby Ridge siege as training for their agents on what not to do, it was still, at the time, all you heard. And I didn't follow it very closely, but all I got was he's a crazy white supremacist holed up on a mountaintop, and that's just not what happened. And I felt that going through these things, for listeners, they're very American. But I'll bring up Alan Watt. I'll say Alan Watt used to always say that if there was going to be some kind of resistance against worldwide tyranny, that it would be coming from Americans, because he said Americans are the only ones now who have any recollection at all of personal freedom and liberty.
Yeah, I agree.
And so to listen to this, to watch this documentary and to see this and to understand, this was more than 30 years ago now, how people who made mistakes, no doubt about it, mistakes were made by Randy Weaver. But essentially, he was a man who was trying to take care of his family in the way that he saw fit, whether we understand that or not.
Yes. I really kind of, I heard seen all the headlines and heard all the broadcasts about it at the time. And, it still didn't add up with me, because in the end it had to do with the guy's personal beliefs and his own personal freedom to protect his family. That's something that's guaranteed to us, the ability to do that. And the way I seen it was, here's this guy, he's got these beliefs, whether I have them or not doesn't really matter. But they went up and started killing members of his family. And they were supposed to be the same people that would keep that from happening in the United States. But as I learned more about it, I learned about the ATF and the FBI being involved in it, and the ATF was involved in it in a undercover way that got him to do something that was illegal, and then they turned around and used that against him in their pursuit of cleaning out undesirable thoughts and freedoms. And that would include the First Amendment, Second Amendment, Fourth Amendment, 10th Amendment, right on through. And I just had a problem with it. And when the people of Waco were under siege on the final day, that was 2 days before my birthday. So I remembered that, and then just 2 years later, the Oklahoma bombing incident happened, Oklahoma City bombing, and that was done on 2 days before my birthday. So they're very poignant in my mind. Mm-hmm. And it just really caused me to start questioning things. And, the internet wasn't as robust as what it is now. And it was hard to get information on some of that stuff. But, there were people that I knew down in Texas. I had went down and lived in Houston for a while, and I knew some people down there, and I remained in contact with them, be it by phone, but they explained to me that these guys were just living in their home, believing the way they wanted to believe, and next thing you know, they're burned out, shot out, wiped out, and I couldn't reconcile that.
Alan has talked a lot about what happened there with the ATF basically doing a kind of a ritual. They bowed to the fire there. The ATF, for those of you who don't know, that's the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Enforcement Division. And, it was what happened at Waco was pretty horrible. And the same sniper who the FBI used, the same sniper who killed Vicki Weaver, 2 years later, that sniper was also used at Waco. And I just wanted to touch again on Ruby Ridge. What Randy Weaver's crime is that he was approached by, I'll back up the story just a little bit for people who didn't follow it or were unaware of it altogether, but he was living with his family in a minding his own business kind of way. They did all their gardening. They believed, because of religious beliefs, that the end of the world was upon them. And his wife, Vicki Weaver, homeschooled the children, and if his grown daughter is any mark to go by, they really enjoyed their childhood. They liked life up on that mountain. And they had it was very remote, but one of the neighboring clusters of population happened to be a group of people who were self-identified as belonging to the Aryan nation.
Yeah, the white supremacists.
Right.
That's where he got that trademark.
That's right. And he was not a member of that group, but they were friendly enough to those people, and their children liked to play with his children. And, whether I think if, whether that was a good idea or not, you either believe in personal liberty and the freedom to associate with whom you want to if you're not bringing harm to someone, or you don't believe in that. And so he was essentially minding his own business, but that Aryan Nation group had already been infiltrated by the ATF. And I'm sure there was other, agencies as well that had infiltrated, and they were trying to get this group on anything. So they were under observation, and an undercover guy from the ATF approached Weaver and said, just kept on him, knew that the Weavers didn't have a lot of money and they needed some money, and he offered to pay him to modify some shotguns, saw them off. He shortened
the barrel length.
Yeah. So
they were in a situation. It was really, really remote. They had no electricity, no water, no running water. I mean, they had water, but they had to carry it up to where they lived, I guess. And the only outing that they really had, the only social outlet, was to go to this place up near them, and that was kind of a highlight with the family, with the kids, getting out. And happened to be white supremacist, Aryan Nation, and, they just enjoyed just fellowship. And I don't know that he really ever became a member of it or anything, but I guess he was approached while he was there.
It's one of those topics that can immediately become emotional for people, because we're conditioned to say racist, but it isn't a crime. It isn't a crime to want to be in a community with people who are like you. No matter who you identify with as your tribe. Again,
yeah.
So this is where he found himself, and this is what happened to him. And because he had done this, the ATF knew that they had a federal crime on him, and they went to work to try to get him to infiltrate, to bring him, some dirt back to them on the Aryan Nation. And my little limited understanding from a day of looking at it is that he didn't feel that he was a part of them, and he didn't want to do that. So this is where things spiral out of control for him.
Yes, I don't really know whether he was actually a member of that particular group. I understood that they socialized because they were in the same area. I'm not even sure that they were that close.
That was my understanding too, and I think that's the way his daughter characterized it. Is that, this was a social event for us as a family. So,
kind of like going to the county fair,
right?
I don't agree with white supremacy or whatever the Aryan Nation, neo-Nazi, whatever they are. I don't agree with them, but it's not my place to judge whether they should be allowed to hang out, live, have their own beliefs. Their beliefs are guaranteed as a right given by God and not the government.
Right.
And the government cannot take away a right that God has given.
Right.
And that's the government themselves stated in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution that those rights were given by God.
Yes. And I'm with you. I mean, this is not beliefs that would be for me at all, but I don't have to associate with people who believe that. But I don't want the government telling me that I have to believe a certain way or think a certain way and then vilifying me or painting me as something that I'm not. That's the very nature of freedom.
Yeah.
It's the essence of freedom.
And the essence of no freedom is vilification of individuals, groups, religions
Mm-hmm.
that don't necessarily meet the standards of what right-thinking, good citizens would do.
Right.
And I don't agree with that. It's not what we were designed. We were designed to self-govern ourselves and not be told what we can and what we can't do, as long as we don't harm anybody or bring harm to anybody
mm-hmm.
by what we're doing.
Right.
And they have that right to carry on life like that.
Mm-hmm. There was one other interesting little thing that I learned in watching this documentary about the Weavers, and that was, you know how we've heard Alan Watt talk about Bo Gritz?
Was he involved in negotiating, maybe?
He was involved in negotiating. The context that I had heard Alan speak of Bo Gritz often was that, essentially Alan has always said, don't join anything. If you join a group, it's a guarantee that it's going to be infiltrated by somebody. The CIA, FBI, ATF, you name it, there's going to be somebody there keeping tabs on it. Don't join groups. And his example of that was often Bo Gritz, who was a decorated military veteran, he had run for some political election way back when, and he had gained a certain amount of popularity amongst people who would have identified as patriots or on what they then called Patriot Radio. And so when Randy Weaver's wife was already killed, dead, the FBI did not seem to be aware of that, and she had been in the kitchen on the floor dead for a week, and he was not coming out, and he would not talk to the FBI negotiators. They brought in Bo Greitz. And the reason they did was because he had this popularity with the patriot-type people. And Bo was able to negotiate Randy Weaver. First, I think the daughters left the house, and eventually Randy Weaver came out. But the way that Alan has told us what Bo did is after 9/11, here he has this following of patriots, and he's gathered a lot of names the way they always do. I have a survey for you, or if you believe in your Second Amendment rights, or then sign here, or call in, or tell us. So he had been gathering names of patriots for years in this position as a popular war, veteran kind of fellow. And after 9/11, he came out and said, if you want to know who's behind 9/11, just take a look at these, conspiracy theorists, that, the people who believe in the black helicopters. That is where you're going to find who's behind it. So in other words, Bo Greitz sold out the people who had been following him, the people that he had professed to be one of them and a believer in rights and freedom. So it's the cautionary tale is don't join groups.
Yes, I believe that thoroughly. I was involved for a very limited time with a group, and I found out that the group really didn't care about facts surrounding different events, historical facts about individuals that they became part of. I watched most of the members of a group that I was involved with jump on a Trump train and become Trump deplorables like overnight, and you couldn't tell them anything about the history of Donald Trump or what he had been involved in. And, it's something that...
Oh, that is interesting. And there was something that you had mentioned to me about that I wanted to talk about. But before we jumped off this other, I was thinking, the way in which everything is controlled, the way that we're given things. When I was studying, again, Waco, and really for the first time the Ruby Ridge, I was thinking about how things are presented, including the way in which people come out and protest, and the protest songs that they're given, and in other words, the way the whole thing is painted. And I stumbled on a song called Ruby Ridge, and it just made me it brought to mind that movie Wag the Dog, where you basically have the U.S. behind a completely fictionalized war that's going on somewhere in Eastern Europe, so that they can take the public's eyes off of a scandal that's at home. But the lengths that they went through, including having a song composed, putting it on a record where it's kind of got a scratchy sound to it, going and putting it in the Smithsonian's archive so that it looked like it really was an 80-year-old album record. These are the lengths that our ruling elite will go to keep us in the dark, to keep us believing the false narrative that these agencies are always the good guys, and the crackpots who want to be left alone to, have their crackpot ideas they don't really want to be left alone. They want to cause mayhem and chaos. They're terrorists. They're homegrown terrorists.
Yeah, that's pretty much the motif that you see with all the different law enforcement shows that are out right now. I know some people that religiously watch those shows, and they're beyond waking up. You can't really reach them. I think there's a level of brainwashing that they've got that no matter what happens anywhere, the good guys are the FBI, NCIS. I don't know how many different crime shows they might have out there, but it seems to be lengthy.
Yeah. Yeah. It's definitely indoctrination that, you see them as the good guys. Absolutely. And that's unfortunate. I know some people now talk about, well, the FBI used to be the good guys. Now they've suddenly become compromised. Just so.
Yeah. Well, I had mentioned maybe talking to you earlier. I'm not sure if it was yesterday or maybe a conversation before, but I really view the whole scheme of things as far as government, the elite, as a mafia, as organized crime.
Mm-hmm.
And, in the good old movies that you used to see, they'd have a beat cop on their payroll, and they'd grab a judge here and that sort of thing playing out. But now they have presidents and prime ministers and senators and congressmen and all the folks that make up government. They have compromised through different various remedies.
Mm-hmm.
Just like Jeffrey Epstein, kept the little black book. Well, I'm sure not everything was in a little black book. I think the book was much bigger.
You were saying that even after all of these events in your lifetime, watching Vietnam, the Teamsters, what happened to your father, seeing Ruby Ridge and Waco, you still, when 9/11 happened, you went to the default position. And,
yes, I did.
Yeah.
I bought what they said, hook, line, and sinker. And it was 4 or 5 years until I got information enough. First of all, I was involved a lot with my own life at the time because I was going through some things myself. But I started getting information, little tidbits here and there, and then started watching documentaries and, it's just, they're facts that can't be erased.
Mm-hmm.
And if you haven't already been brainwashed, you cannot be brainwashed into believing what the narrative was at the time. It's just too convenient. They find a pristine passport on the sidewalk. They don't find any jet engines, no tail sections, no wings, nothing like that.
Yeah.
But they find a passport.
Right.
And then you look at Shanksville, Pennsylvania, and you see a big hole in the ground. And they're telling you that a plane vaporized when it hit the ground and there's nothing left of it. Oh, well, we found some stuff 8 miles away over here, No, you didn't.
Yeah.
You're asking me to believe something impossible, and any objective, questioning person can see through that.
Right.
If you can't see through that, then you have been completely brainwashed.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of people have been, and we continue to see that with what we've lived through the last 3 years now, is that There are some people that no matter what you show them and how carefully you try to walk them through what is happening, they are incapable of absorbing it. They just cannot take it in.
Yeah. Well, like, one of the first things that convinced me that 9/11 wasn't as it was portrayed was a photograph of Shanksville, Pennsylvania crash site. I believe it was Flight 98, maybe. Mm-hmm. And I took a look at that, and now I've seen the headlines, and these people were heroes that got control of the plane or got control of the hijackers, and the plane ended up dive bombing into the ground and disappearing. And it just didn't work out for me. Mm-hmm. I couldn't reconcile that at all. And I think if people really took a look at just that picture right there, the initial aftermath with the very first responders there looking at an indentation in the earth with no wreckage, nothing recognizable as a aircraft at all, much less, there wasn't anything that you could identify as having to do with the plane. Mm-hmm. And, this was, like I said, it was 3 or 4 years, 5 years after the fact that I actually seen the photograph, and I'm thinking back to the narrative of the initial broadcast during the time. And when I seen that picture, I was like, well, a plane didn't crash there. Anybody can see that, and it's the same thing like an aluminum body aircraft flying through structural concrete and steel, some metal supports that are 4 foot wide, 4 foot by 4 foot. And that's just going to knock a wing off the airplane. It's going to fall to the ground. It's going to be down on the ground. It's going to knock the engines off. It's not going to just vaporize and disappear into the building. And, I could not believe that I was suckered in to believing anything about that after I seen that type of photographic evidence.
One thing that I talked to Alan about early on was it really is kind of that default position, or what he would call your very earliest indoctrination, that is so skillfully, now the early indoctrination seems to be no, little boy, you're a girl, or we're melting, the climate is heating up super fast, that kind of thing. But for most generations going back a long time, at least 150 years in this country, it has been your country, your nation, the stars and stripes and all of that. And I remember telling him that even though I didn't consider, I hadn't been a so-called patriot, like at the time of Ruby Ridge, listening to Patriot Radio, none of that, and didn't really consider myself, I loved my country, but it just wasn't a rabid thing where I was always talking about the Constitution. And yet, in a movie, if I'm watching a movie or I see some footage of a body coming back with the flag draped over it and the family is standing there crying, the sense of belonging to the country and the sense that the country is good is so strong.
Yes, the emotional inclusion.
Yep, absolutely. And he said, well, it takes a lot of thinking and a lot of time to be able to separate yourself out of those emotions so that your emotions aren't played, so that you can really clearly see what is happening. And you were describing that it was after you really got into questioning 9/11 and years more of the research that you finally ended up discovering Alan and then kind of taking the whole seeking to a different level of understanding.
Yeah, I think, really, I think the powers that be were a lot better at covering things up. But really, if you get down to it, it's just the internet came along and kept them from being able to cover things up the way that they had in the past. So some of it is brought out. It's so blatant that if you just use a minuscule amount of common sense, you can navigate through the cover-ups, the lies, the deception, the division that's caused, and that sort of thing right there is where I was. The internet benefited me because I wasn't afraid to get in and dive in and look into it. I took the time.
Right. And I think this is a really good time for me to say I wanted to share with listeners, and especially those who go and check out the little MP4 that we'll make of this talk, so that we put some images in there, and we'll put them up on the Alan Watt CTTM YouTube and BitChute channels. You can see some of the visual images. You sent me pictures of your carpentry, some beautiful homes that you did the kitchen cabinetry in, a boathouse that you did the cabinets for, some of the close-up work of you working on the what you'd call the face frame, I think it is, the frame around some bookshelves or shelving. Beautiful work. And I bring this up because I think that ultimately, through your lifetime, starting out and learning the trade in the construction business, you did become a master carpenter. And when I look at your work, when I look at the mind, the detail-oriented kind of mind that does that work, then I understand that you are someone who, given the tool of the internet, could really dive in and do some great homework, because you're going to pay attention to detail and you're going to compare things and say, is this even? Does this match up? And I think if you just shared a little bit about some of the intense research that you did for this group that you were a member of for a while, where it, in regards to what you discovered about Donald Trump, I just think it's interesting, A, because it shows the research that you were able to do, and B, it shows how unwilling people who were so so well indoctrinated, they were just completely unwilling to accept what you brought them.
Yeah. Probably from, I'd say, the middle 80s, 1985 on up, Donald Trump made several appearances on television talk shows. Oprah Winfrey had him on, Montel Williams had him on, and way back, I think even Rona Barrett had him on. I don't even know if you'll remember her.
I do. I remember her, yeah.
Yeah. But one of the mainstay questions, especially with Oprah Winfrey, is what would Donald Trump do? What would President Donald Trump do in this situation?
Interesting.
And looking back, that to me was the beginning of the grooming of Donald Trump for presidency. And I spent a tremendous amount of time in Florida and was aware of a lot of the deeds that had to do with Donald Trump just from real life. I met people that had actually worked on jobs that had to do with Donald Trump. And I even knew of some electricians I didn't know the owner of the company or anything, but these guys were out driving the truck and on the job sites and doing the work. And I watched this electrical contractor get put out of business because he didn't get paid on the job that Donald Trump was responsible for paying for. And to me, I was an independent contractor. That was very important information because, yeah, hey, it'd be great. Yeah, I worked over here on this job for Donald Trump, and yeah, maybe it's part of notoriety and everything.
Well, you actually told me that this electrical contractor, when you mentioned it yesterday, you said that he didn't get paid, but he not only didn't get paid, but it was such a significant amount, he declared bankruptcy and his wife left him.
That's correct. And I don't know what happened to there was a couple of different guys that I knew that worked for that electrical contractor. I don't know what really became of them. I know they're smart enough to where they probably had no problem the next day. They could just go right over and start working for another electrical contractor. But the owner of that business suffered greatly from it. But these are the kind of things that, that were imparted to me early. And so he decided that he was going to run for president in 2015 and announced his candidacy. And because I was involved with this one group, I decided that it was an obligation of mine to go ahead and learn more about him, to dig into it. And at that time, I was an administrator for 1/4 of this state of Indiana, and there was quite a few people that I felt like depended on me. They nominated me for the position. I didn't ask for it or anything. They just knew that I was above board and would look into things, and I shared a lot of good information with them, and a lot of that information came from Alan Watt.
That's great.
And so I did. I looked into it. I did a pretty thorough, deep dive. I mean, when you get in there, one thing leads to another, leads to another, leads to another. And, Donald Trump used to say, yeah, my dad loaned me $1 million to start out with, and I made it into this empire. Well, he got $1 million from his father, but he was right back into his father's account for another $3.95 million because he blew the $1 million, and he had to have more money to cover the debt that he had created with blowing the initial $1 million that he said his father loaned him. And then I got into a bankruptcy that had to do with the Taj Mahal in Atlantic City, where Donald Trump actually purchased that establishment from Meyer Lansky.
Wow.
Meyer Lansky is, at that time, he was the head of the known mafia.
Mm-hmm.
At least the front man that anybody got to see.
Right.
And he was $3.95 billion in debt at the time of the bankruptcy. There were 74 different banks involved, and he got bailed out by a Rothschild banking agent by the name of Wilbur Ross.
Uh-huh.
Wilbur Ross went on to become the Secretary of Commerce.
I remember that.
For the United States. Another friend of Donald Trump became the Secretary of Labor.
Mm-hmm.
His name was Alex Acosta.
Mm-hmm.
And he was the guy that got Jeffrey Epstein the sweet deal, as they called it, down in Florida when there was a sex crimes type of crime against Epstein as far as dealing with underage girls and so forth. And so he got this deal where he was put into a minimum security prison. He could check out during the daytime, go about his business, come back and check back in.
Wow.
And that was a shortened sentence. It was supposed to be 18 months. But anyway, I guess Acosta got a lot of flack over that as well. He should have. But he ended up becoming Secretary of Labor.
Mm-hmm. But when you presented, you presented a nice, tidy package of various kinds of information, but these guys that were rah-rah just did not want to take it in.
No, they wanted to hear certain things, and they heard it.
Mm-hmm.
I think just about anybody can go to a group of people and tell them what they want to hear, and that person will somehow become important within the group. I, on the other hand, was ostracized, to the point where I just kind of threw my hands up and voluntarily left, because I'd say 90% of the people within the group became Trump deplorables. And, the individual Donald Trump I have absolutely nothing against. The businessman Donald Trump, he's not a good businessman. He was never a good businessman. Mm-hmm. We shouldn't have a president of the United States that's been in some kind of court case over 3,000 times. One was actually a RICO suit in the Southern District of New York federal court.
RICO is racketeering.
Exactly. Money laundering, fraud.
Right.
Extortion. He was named with 12 other people in that suit, and George Soros was one of those co-defendants.
Ooh.
And George Soros was actually a business partner of Trump's son-in-law, who was his chief advisor.
I think I remember reading a little bit of that. Yes, absolutely. That Soros had even financially backed to the tune of many hundreds of millions, or quite a stack of money, to Jared.
Yeah,
Kushner.
I think he had accredited that particular real estate venture with $250 million.
Mm-hmm.
And so, there's a lot of flimsy dealings going on. There were like 79 different companies that Donald Trump had control of that were under an alias name. I was actually at a hotel near Vero Beach. I didn't know it was his or anything at the time, but I was actually working with bees, honeybees, and one of the fellows that was with us was a beekeeper from Russia. His name was Valentino. And he says, why don't we just stop here for a few minutes and kind of come in and get rested up a little bit? So we did, and everybody in the whole hotel lobby and bar area were Russian. I mean, me and my partner, who was an elderly man at the time, great person, Henry Parker, but we were the only people there that spoke English, basically. Everything else was going on around us was in some sort of Russian dialect, or I didn't understand really. So and then I later found out that was property owned by Donald Trump.
Interesting. Well, I think that we are more or less out of time here, but we spoke a little bit about a book called Red Mafia.
Yes.
Did we talk about that? Yeah. Or Mafia, it's spelled with a Y in there, but
right.
That's an interesting one to give you a story about basically the Russian mafia that was brought in during the time that Trump would have been developing his casinos in New Jersey, but it shows this interesting organized crime infiltration by Russian mafia all up and down the eastern seaboard from New Jersey down to Florida. Fascinating book, really, really interesting. Yeah. But I think that we might just have to talk about that book and some of your other things that you've uncovered. But I will say that we'll put in more of the images of your beautiful cabinetry. Again, to me, when I looked at that, I'm like, oh, okay, I see why you're the kind of thinker that really digs into something and wants to see it from a bunch of different angles and keeps uncovering and seeing what measures up and what doesn't.
Yeah, that's a different spark of an outlook. I never really thought about it like that before, but I can see where that kind of goes hand in hand as it pertains to some of the things that I do.
Well, sure, because, we're not exactly what we do. That's not really who we are, or all of us, but it certainly, if you excel at something, it speaks to qualities that you have, and attention span, attention to detail. I'm not the most detail-oriented person. I don't think I could be a master carpenter.
Yeah, well, a lot of people are satisfied after it's there, but sometimes they go through a hard time waiting for it to get there.
Well, I've certainly enjoyed talking with you today, and I hope that other people have gotten something out of a little bit of your life as it fits into the backdrop of some of the bigger events that have happened in this country in the last 30, 35 years.
Well, the pleasure's all mine. I enjoy speaking about such things. Unfortunately, the audience that accept such things is very limited.
Yes.
And I can't control that, and that's okay with me. It doesn't frustrate me. I just take it as it is and move on.
That's right. I'm not expecting, just huge stacks of people to want to hear and learn about real history. But for those of you who are curious to see events and to see the times we're living through from the perspective of the people that are living through it, I hope that you'll continue to tune in every Thursday for a little bit of real history. And thank you again, Jim.
Thank you. You can take that work that Alan left and carry on with it. And I just enjoy seeing that his website remains up and running and that his word still gets out. And now venturing into your words and Weston's words, I think it's a great thing, and I'm glad to be a part of it.
Thanks, Jim. And we'll talk again.
Okay, good night, Melissa.
All right. Thank you for listening, and I hope you will tune in again next week. And please go to cuttingthroughthematrix.com. There's literally thousands of hours of talks by Alan Watt, and they're there for your free download. It's such an education, and that really is the real history. So thanks again, and y'all stay out of trouble.